it's the first time for me that this is happening. But usually I'm the one starting to record, so I don't know actually what is happening with the others. It's funny now that I need to realize that I also need to turn on my camera and the mic. Here we are.
Okay, mic working? Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
Okay, then now we're recording, then I will just start. Hi everyone and welcome back to a new episode of Dare to Care, our animal welfare podcast that dares to care for more than just the human animals. And we talk to inspiring people from the field of animal welfare. Today we take it even broader to animal ethics. And we are excited to speak in a trio. You will hear another new voice today. I am Annette, supporting Masha, the host of the podcast, and I'm a veterinarian as well, and also a publishing editor for books in veterinary sciences. And together we explore the field and talk to inspiring people that are passionate about animal welfare and ethics. So we talk in a trio today, and our guest is none other than Clive Phillips, Australia's first professor of animal welfare. And he just published a new book, an open access book, entitled Towards an Ethical Approach to Animals, a life learning about animal welfare. And in this work, he presents thoughts and possible solutions, let's say, to the key problems in our human-animal relations, taking a historical and futuristic look. And we are super excited to learn more about him, about this work, to share it with you and to discuss. And thank you, Clive, for being here. Also, of course, thank you, Masha, for having us all together. And please, Clive, maybe the floor is yours. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit more for our listeners?
Thank you, Annette, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm Clive Phillips. I came over to Australia 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, to take up the first chair of animal welfare there. My background is in agriculture. I studied agriculture way back in the 1970s, did a PhD on dairy science, and then was lecturing at universities in North Wales and Cambridge in the vet school for 20 years, and then out to Australia. And that's when the real animal welfare challenges began, I think.
So now it's the third voice that you hear. This is Masha. And I find it so interesting when you just introduced yourself, Clive, that you really can see that the traveling from one side of the globe to the opposite, actually. And then also when I heard that you were maybe still are teaching veterinarians. The profession that Annette and I am part of, but you're not a veterinarian yourself. And I found this super cool to have. I think I would have loved it as a student back then to be also exposed to non-veterinarians and to have then also probably a different view from the teacher. So I don't know, maybe this is a random question, nothing to do with animal welfare, but how was it for you as a non-veterinarian interacting with veterinarians quite a lot over the time?
I think it was a great pleasure. I've tended to find that veterinary students in particular, they have enormous passion for the welfare of animals. And I welcomed that greatly, and found it a great privilege to be telling them about the welfare of mainly farm animals, especially transported farm animals. And they were very receptive, and I found it a great pleasure to be teaching them. Nearly all girls. Nothing wrong with that, and. They were passionate about animal welfare, both in Cambridge and in Queensland. And indeed, I'd say the two groups were actually quite similar. Probably in Queensland, there was a bit more of a focus on farm animals, whereas in Cambridge, there was more of a focus on companion animals, because most of the students would go on to practice with companion animals.
Did you kind of yeah, had to fight a bit to bring that topic of welfare into the curricula, or was that kind of an established thing that you could add to?
Yes, that's a good question, Annette. I think in Cambridge it was very well established. Animal welfare lectures were given by Professor Broom and myself. But when I went to Queensland, there was an established animal welfare course, but I had to fight to get that recognised in the curriculum, and particularly when I wanted to introduce elements of animal ethics, which is quite contentious for a lot of veterinary students. Then, yeah, there were some difficulties in that, but I was proud to have introduced the first animal ethics course for veterinary bioscientists, not the veterinary students per se, but the first animal ethics course that University of Queensland had ever run.
I mean, it's usually like one of my first questions that I ask people, because I'm super curious about is there like an event maybe that happened, or like what made you interested into not only animals, but then specifically welfare of animals? Did this happen already when you were studying back in the UK? When did you start to find your path into this research field of animal ethics and welfare?
Yeah, I'd say I made that switch as a teenager. My family was steeped in the arts. My father was a historian. They were all artists or historians. And when I was at school, I just found a passion for animal biology. Loved it. Yeah. And I carried on from that. I was very fortunate in going to Cambridge, where there was a very active animal welfare group under Professor Donald Broom, who was the world's first professor of animal welfare, I think. And yeah, we had a great group there, and we would meet regularly with all the animal welfare luminaries and discuss the popular topics of the day. So that was a great training as well. But for me, it started very early on, and I was incredibly lucky as well. When I first went to university to teach in North Wales, I had pretty much an open book as to what I could teach and where I took my interests. I don't think universities are like that anymore, and I was just very, very lucky having that opportunity to direct my research, which was focused on the dairy cow at the time, and I swung away from dairy cow nutrition, which was the subject of my PhD largely, and started looking more and more at the welfare of the dairy cow.
It's super great to see this growth and also the success of it, right? Like from the thought and the passion to, maybe looking back at what you all achieved and have done. And this might be super linked to the next question and back to your book again, because it also encompasses your memoirs, right, in the first part. So we can learn more about, how these all evolved and how you came to the thoughts you present in the second part. And then maybe if we may ask, because you're experienced in publishing and you worked across different publishers, what especially motivated you to realize this new work?
Especially because you just mentioned that it took a while to finally publish it. So like just before we started recording, you mentioned that it took a couple of decades now. So I'm really curious about this.
Well, I actually started writing it when I went to Cambridge, 1995, I think. And again, I was very, very lucky because at Cambridge, I had again an open book to take my work whatever direction I wanted to. And I had no hindrance, and I had time. One forgets that time is really important for university staff to produce the ideas. And I had plenty of time and plenty of time to read. I just hadn't had that time previously. I'd been on the research treadmill. The university wants you to produce so many papers a year and get grants in worth so much. Cambridge was wonderful because it just gave me all that time to think and develop ideas. So that's what I did. And coming out to Australia was also fortunate in many ways. It was a huge challenge, but it really showed me what the real world of animal welfare problems was like. It wasn't that long before I did a trip with my wife. We went around Australia, visited 50 cattle and sheep farmers and talked to them all a couple of days each about animal welfare issues. And that really began to cement my understanding and beliefs about animal welfare in a country which was renowned for its livestock production, whereas the UK livestock production had been a pretty small player in the political scene of things, at least.
And when you look at the book, I mean, it's quite comprehensive. I haven't read it in total, I must admit, but it also has been just published a couple of weeks ago, maybe like 3 weeks. But if you look at your book and all the different aspects you cover there, are there like specific ones, or like maybe only one that is really close to your heart, that is you maybe consider also the most relevant one?
Yes, as I was reading in research for the book, I came across a lot of statistics about the demise of our wildlife populations, and I really wasn't that familiar with that. And it turned out that over the last 50 years, which was the duration of my working with animals, we've actually diminished our wildlife populations by about 2/3. I was stunned by that. At the same time, I was reading about and was very interested in the origin of life, why life exists on the planet. And I put the two together and found that in reducing our wildlife populations by 2/3 in the last 50 years, that wildlife on Earth has actually had, and I forget the exact statistic, but when I calculated it, it was something like 99.999997% of its total time on Earth. And losing species at the rate we are, it seems it would be anticipated that there would actually be no wildlife left on Earth after about 2,000 years, which is quite a long time. And there have been some recent estimates which actually put it at even less than that. So that really stunned me. And I thought, this is a message that needs to get out. It motivated me to explore these issues more in the book.
It's really like shocking numbers, but also giving it some numbers and the perspective might help to wake people up, to have some numbers and like, how do you say, not a vision, but a guess.
For me with wildlife is what is so fascinating about when you realize the numbers and the extreme ways how humans have impacted wildlife and just like the amount of species we have and the amount of animals on planet Earth. Because at least from my perspective at the moment, we are quite detached from them. Like it seems so far away, and I think I don't remember exactly what kind of course it was or like what kind of lecture, but I saw a graph where you see the numbers of livestock we have on the planet at the moment, and I mean they are there because of us humans. Like we are the reason for that. We produce them, we breed them, and they are there for our consumption as well. And then with wildlife, it's like there's this tiny bit of animals, this tiny amount, and still we are also not only starting, but we are already using them as well for our benefit. And that always brings me to the questions like, why do animals have to have a benefit for us? So I was wondering, like, what is your perspective on that, your view on the benefit of animals for humans, for only one of the many species we have?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right, and something I could have mentioned before, that, as wildlife have diminished, the number of farm animals has multiplied enormously. And such that, and again, it shocked me that wildlife, well, in biomass terms, I think is about 20 million tons of carbon on the Earth compared to farm animals, 630 million tons of carbon on the Earth, and humans 390. So, farm animals make up the majority of the biomass, the animal biomass on the planet. and they're taking a huge proportion of the resources. As to my feelings on the ethics of that, well, obviously, as a vegetarian and for the most part vegan, I find that the use of animals in that way for human benefit is not a good idea. We are losing so much in terms of our planetary resources to farm animals that's one of the things that says to me, this cannot continue. But not only that, I'm sure as veterinarians you're well aware that it's posing a very great risk to human health and to the spread of diseases around the planet, as well as contributing significantly to climate change, other human health issues, a whole raft of reasons why we shouldn't allow domesticated animals in this way to replace our wildlife. And our wildlife has been evolving in total, animal life has existed on the planet for over 4 billion years. Complex animal life has existed for between 1 and 2 billion years. To wipe it all out in 50 years just seemed to me incredible. That also gave me impetus to want to give this message to the world. And I coupled that as well with doing research on how unique is our animal life. Now, we hear an awful lot about that, about whether other planets have evolved animal life. Everyone's looking for it. The biosignatures which have never been found. And the more I looked into it, the more doubtful I became that there is any other animal life, definitely in our galaxy, and almost certainly in the universe. Certainly not of the higher capabilities type, because they have never been in contact with us, the so-called well-known Fermi paradox, which says that why haven't, if other animals have evolved on other planets, why haven't they contacted us? So I looked into that a bit and, thought that it is highly unlikely that there is intelligent life of our type on other planets. Ours is incredibly unique, therefore, and here we are within my lifetime, 50 years out of the 4 billion years or so that animal life has been evolving, we've destroyed most of it, which seemed to me highly undesirable.
Yeah, and just to add maybe the sad thing coming back to the livestock and taking so much space, also not all like physically space on Earth, but also in our human-animal relationships. Maybe the sad thing is, even though they take more space, we might not necessarily treat them better than we treat the wild species, right? So maybe if we look at the livestock specifically, do you see, you mentioned also, of course, pollution, climate change, but maybe also seeing the animals themselves, some main challenges we have to overcome considering livestock?
You're right, Annette. I didn't mention welfare, which is rather strange for an animal welfare professor, but you're absolutely right. And yeah, I'm a great believer in the welfare of wildlife, as long as we leave them to their own devices and don't interfere with their habitat, as we so often do. But if they do have a natural habitat, then I think the welfare of wildlife is for the most part good. And that was recognized as long ago as Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species, where he said that the welfare of wildlife, that they don't feel fear for the most part. It would be counterproductive for them to do so, because fear uses a lot of resources in an animal's body. The end, when it comes, is usually pretty swift. And so the way we treat our farm animals, I think, is to a large extent much worse than our wildlife. That's a contentious view, but certainly for our farm animals that are kept indoors on concrete in often rather dirty, uncomfortable environments, and only having a very short life, I think is all counting against them when we do a welfare calculation, comparing them with the wildlife.
It's interesting because some might argue that wildlife is more exposed to danger, and I mean they do experience. We definitely at least recognize that some animals are capable of experiencing fear, and especially the ones that need to run away from predators. I definitely had discussions with people who said, well, at least in captivity, humans can take care of them and make sure that certain needs are fulfilled. What would you respond to them?
Let's consider the welfare of, let's say, the grazing herbivores on the African plains. What is their welfare like? Well, there may be predators fairly close to the herd, but those predators will generally take only the weak and the diseased animals. For the most part, I'm pretty convinced that the animals feel no fear of the predators until they become perhaps weak and are then, there's an adrenaline rush if they get chased by an animal and within a few minutes they're that animal's dinner. By contrast, the well-being of animals in a housed environment we know is generally very poor. Let's consider the dairy cow, for example, in intensive production systems. 50 years ago, those animals would be living at least 10 years. And now we see that the average lifespan of the intensively farmed dairy cow is only about 4 or 5 years. Because within that period of time, they've succumbed to the stresses of very high milk production. But especially they're likely to have either got chronic mastitis or maybe acute environmental mastitis, severe lameness, or they fail to reproduce. And they succumb to that fairly quickly. So the natural lifespan of the cow is about 25 years, and they're only lasting about 5 years. So that says to me that their welfare is incredibly poor. We can look at lots of other examples. I've traveled on the ships with sheep going up to the Middle East, and I know that those animals' welfare is at times incredibly poor. And when they get to the other end, it's not much better either. So for a long time, I've felt that we shouldn't be exporting animals over, thousands of kilometers over long periods of time. So my own belief, and I've been involved with farm animals for 50 years or so now, is that their welfare has become gradually worse as we've intensified their production systems over the last 20 or 30 years. The last dairy farm I visited in China had 30,000 cows in it. 30,000 cows, absolutely enormous. And the welfare of those cows, well, I thought it was pretty poor. They were housed all year round, of course. No respite. They never see sunlight, let alone a blade of grass. And they're fed a very high protein diet to produce those high milk yields that make for cheap milk. So, for me, that was pretty poor welfare. I'll just add, Masha, when I started my involvement with dairy cows, because my sister married a dairy farmer's son, and I used to go up when I was a teenager onto their farm and help with the cows. There were 50 Ayrshire cows in beautiful circumstances and 3 people looking after them. Now we have 3 people looking after 1,000 cows. They were all known by name, they were loved. One just can't say that about the cows in these big modern intensive dairy farms.
One aspect, because this really struck me, was that when you talked about the welfare or well-being of the animals, like non-human animals, you were not only considering what was happening during their lifespan while they were still alive, but also kind of the life that they couldn't live. And I think this is an interesting view because it completely changes actually then your perspective or like perception of welfare. It's also the years that you couldn't experience, so the chance to live.
Yes, it's a good point, and it's an idea that I first developed when I was writing a book on the welfare of animals, which was published about 95, I think. And that's what I thought then, that, the life they could have had and were missing out on was a part of their welfare. But everyone was telling me, all the animal welfare scientists around me were saying, no, when an animal's dead, it hasn't got any welfare. And it's only recently that I've been discussing it again with some more enlightened animal scientists, animal welfare scientists, and I'll particularly mention Andrew Knight here, because he and I had that discussion, and he agreed and thought the life they could have lived was an important part of the welfare equation. And since that time, I've been even more adamant that yes, welfare, if you cut an animal's life down to just a few weeks, then you have destroyed its opportunity to have good animal welfare.
So Annette and maybe I'll bring it back also to you, because this brings me to the question of a lot of times when we talk about animal welfare, we're also talking about animal welfare issues, then looking at what humans might do to harm animals, cruelty and so on. And it was really interesting when Annette and I, in the preparation for this talk, also had our own discussion, and we were thinking, and well, only started getting into it, about cruelty not only from humans towards other animals and other species, but maybe in between animals, like a monkey to another monkey or something. Annette, maybe you can add some of your thoughts on this cruelty aspect.
Yeah, definitely, because we were wondering, because I think you also raised this question in your book, would animals also be cruel, like maybe towards each other or towards other groups? What did you learn about that when thinking about it? Because it's one aspect of your book as well, right?
It is. Yes, I spent quite a bit of time looking at cruelty, because I think it marks out the human species as one of the cruelest animals on the planet. Our potential to be cruel.
That's harsh.
But it's got to be true. It has to be true, and the more you look at our history of cruelty to each other, no other animal does this. It wouldn't be within it would never be selected for from an evolutionary perspective. But I think as humans, we have the capacity both to be enormously loving. Our empathy, it can be, enormous. But we also have the potential to be very cruel. And yeah.
But are there examples also where you see cruelty, done by others, by other species?
Yes, it does depend how you define cruelty. If cruelty has volitional intent with it, in other words, if I want to inflict harm on another person or another animal, then, that's one way of defining cruelty. But we can also say that cruelty is also just about an animal suffering, an animal feeling pain, for example. And what we've learned recently, probably about the last 15 years or so, is that more and more, we understand that more and more animals can feel pain, particularly some of the invertebrates that were, for many years, have been excluded from any animal welfare consideration, for research animals, for example, because we now know that they can feel pain, and therefore, when we put lobsters into boiling water, then it's going to be pretty painful for them. Or if we pull the legs off a crab, for example, a live crab, then yes, that's going to be pretty painful. We now know that's painful scientifically, especially due to the work of Bob Elwood in Northern Ireland. And we know that these animals are feeling a lot of pain. But if cruelty is something a bit more than that, of wanting to inflict suffering, then it is harder to find animal examples. There are definitely examples where animals will inflict suffering on other animals. I mean, we could say that predators do that all the time. And even that some predators will play with their prey. You think of the whale tossing seals around in the
the killer whales, right?
Yeah.
That's right, the killer whales. So that there are plenty of examples of animals inflicting suffering, but they can be explained by improving the efficiency of the hunt. The animals are learning from that process. Now, it's hard to say that humans are necessarily improving the efficiency of the hunt, but it may be that for psychopaths, for example, that they are improving their ability to gain coercive control over other human beings by playing with them, in inverted commas. So, yeah, I mean, the examples of humans inflicting cruelty are rampant, and I go into quite a lot of detail in that in my book, from biblical times, and look at the impact of crucifixion, for example, on the pain suffered by a human being. Lots of examples, but we don't find nearly as much evidence of that in the rest of the animal kingdom.
And that's also, I think, what I took away from this chapter, that the examples that you might find for cruelty in the animal kingdom might usually have like a biological, as you said, explanation behind it, right?
Yes, that's right, Annette, and that's why I did look into masochism, for example, in some detail, and sadism, and the various forms of humans gaining pleasure from being cruel, even looking at things like bestiality. And it is sometimes hard to see how that is, from an evolutionary perspective, beneficial for the animals.
I just thought for the cruelty aspect, maybe coming back to humans being cruel to the animals around us, that might not be a nice question, but do you think, is there like a worst example? What you think is especially cruel that humans currently still do, unfortunately, to the animals around us? Like something that really needs to be stopped or rethought in the way we do it?
I think it varies a lot between cultures, Annette. Some of the animal practices, even in Europe, actually, some of the, when goats are thrown off the steeples of churches, and some of the cultural traditions which exist in Europe shock me, bullfighting especially. And living as I do in former British colony, I'm well aware that the colonial situation has largely made those forms of cruelty illegal. There are laws that strictly protect against dog fighting, cockfighting, etc., all that sort of thing. And yet we see that, particularly in Europe, because there are many cultural traditions there, that many of these practices are sustained. And I mentioned bullfighting as one which I find particularly horrific, and yet it continues to this day in Spain and Portugal and parts of France as well. So that would never be allowed, I think, in most other parts of the world.
I mean, one of the things that is fundamental for being able to do all these things as a human species is that we believe and we think, and this goes maybe also to the aspect that about culture, that the humans think that we are superior for whatever kind of reason. And that's something what I find really, really fascinating, that in different cultures there might be different reasons why we or they think are superior or not superior to the other sentient beings around them. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Or like, do you have examples maybe between like the difference between cultures?
Yes, you're right, Masha. There are enormous differences between cultures. One of the ones that stands out most prominently, I think, probably is between the influence of the the so-called organized religions on Western culture compared with the influence of the Eastern religions on culture in Asia and other parts of the world. That there's an enormous contrast there, where in the West we were brought up to believe that man has dominion over animals, and therefore we can use them. And generally, I think the practices, the use of animals in Western cultures is accepted, whereas in a lot of Eastern cultures, it's that use of animals is not accepted. Either people are, the population might be majority vegetarian, or the harmful practices, intensive farming practices, are not allowed to be conducted or don't occur. It's complex because the Western world has, of course, grown much more affluent, and it has the ability to farm animals in a way that allows for a certain amount of welfare, but it still allows them to be farmed, whereas the affordability of that in many Eastern cultures is not so evident. The populations are not as wealthy, and so they can't afford, for example, to have organically produced animals or free-range animals, either because there isn't the space or because it's just too costly. So there is that major difference between the Eastern and the Western cultures, I think, in what we will accept from animals. And of course, enshrined within their religions, there is, I believe, much more respect for animals in the Eastern religions generally, particularly Buddhism, to a lesser extent Hinduism, Sikhism, and also to a great extent in Taoism. And similarly in the animist religions as well, they also give great credence to the value of having animals on our planets, and generally that animals are on a level playing field with humans. They are put on the same sphere. Whereas in Western culture, I think there's much more an attitude, animals are there for us to use.
Yeah, maybe adding to these religious thoughts in the sphere of, humans being superior or thinking they are unique. I was wondering, during the studies for your book, adding the scientific evidence, did you find proof that we might even be unique and there might be a reason to carry this thinking? Or, did you find otherwise?
Yes, like so many scientists today, I've considered in some detail whether there are particular aspects of human physiology that is unique, human culture that is unique. And I draw the same conclusion as pretty well everyone else, that there is nothing that singles out the human species as being completely different to other animals. Be it the perception of religion, for example. Some animals even have some rudimentary religious thoughts, it is believed, when they will attend to the dead, for example. So nothing particularly singles out the human species, except perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, the capacity to be extremely cruel. But we can think also of, the enjoyment of music and things like that, which I spent quite a lot of time in Queensland researching. Animals have a great response to music, great reception to music, which may be because they feel that it is similar to, for example, some of the vocalizations of their species. So there are evolutionary reasons, I think, which will provide benefit to being aware of certain types of music.
This aspect of music is super interesting. That's new for me. And I'm wondering, in which species or animal groups did you discover this?
I've worked mainly with dogs, particularly in the shelter environment, because enriching the shelter environment is sorely needed. Dogs and cats get very stressed when they go into a shelter environment, even if it's only for a few weeks. Highly stressful for them. Come out of a home environment and suddenly they're with lots of other conspecifics and humans that they don't know. So one way of calming them down, which is very effective, is to play certain types of music. And part of my research in Queensland was to look at the specific features of the music which will be most beneficial for animals. And other animals are also known to be responsive. Many other animals are known to be responsive to music, but it's something which is particularly useful for our companion animals. And if we think again of all those dogs that are left home alone while the owner is out at work, again, there are ways of placating that animal, keeping them calm. What we don't know so much about is whether music sometimes creates that annoying worm in your brain, which is going on and on and on, and you think, for goodness sake, turn that off. I've no idea whether animals experience that at all. Humans obviously do. But we do know that when we look at the behavior, that many animals get calmed down by certain types of music.
Yeah, it would be interesting to look into the type of music, and also, as you say, if it can also cause stress, maybe just because of the noise. I also thought about maybe getting animals used to some background noise. I just remember from the time at university seeing in laboratory, let's say laboratory animal facilities, having a radio on. I don't know if this is useful, but maybe just to make them learn or experience some background noise. So if a caretaker is coming or there's another loud noise of the cleaning or so, could be beneficial maybe to decrease fear. But of course it has to be scientifically proven. I don't know if that was a good concept.
It does. And a number of mistakes have been made in researching the impacts of music on animals. One of them is people ignore the impact on the person looking after the animals. So the lab attendant or the person who's milking the cows with the radio on, he or she may well be a lot calmer with the animals when the music is on. So that's one of the mistakes. Another mistake has been to compare classical music with heavy metal, with, jazz, rock, etc., different musical genres, forgetting that within classical music you've got an enormous difference between, for example, the 1812 overture with all its loud bangs and, say, Grieg's piano concerto, which is, pretty calming. So when we researched it, we took it back to the basics and looked at some of the more fundamental attributes of music directly played to the animals with no humans around, which is relating to the pitch, the tempo, the timbre, the specific characteristics of music which the animals would respond biologically to.
This reminds me actually of a book that I started reading. It's about how animals and different kinds of animals experience the environment and their surrounding, and that because of them having different senses, they experience it differently. And they even use a German word, which I found really funny. They use Umwelt, which is translated environment. But so this completely also changed my view of, and I just started reading it, but it's really, really good to try as humans, to try to put yourself into the shoes of someone like another species and realize how different their reality is, because we humans, and also the whole discussion we just had right now, we view it as humans, like all the opinions we have, also the research we're doing, even though we are using like officially scientific methods, it's always from the human perspective. It's always from, or mainly from how we see and view and experience the world. And we try to compare that and find similarities or not similarities between us and the other realities and experiences. And this is a kind of mind-blowing if you look at it from this.
Yes, that's a really good point, Masha. I think, and when I said that humans are not unique, I didn't mean that we're not different. All the animal species every species is unique and different in its own way. It's just we don't have any superior characteristics. And indeed, sometimes animals have superior characteristics to us. When I think of the synchronized movement of flocks of birds or shoals of fish, and compare that with, human movement on the dance floor, for example. Certainly when I'm on the dance floor, it's not synchronized in any way. It's pretty random. Every species has its own strengths and characteristics, I think. And each species is as valuable as the other. We used to think of there being a pyramid, and humans were on the top, and anthropocentric perspective, I should say, and that view has been changing pretty rapidly. I think the last 20 years or so, people realize that we should give equal value to all the different species. And I don't even think that we should just be recognizing sentient animals. There's a lot of talk of sentience and what that means for animal ethics. Well, I don't think it actually means much at all, because sentience is simply the animal's ability to perceive the environment and to take environmental cues to alert it to specific needs for responses. And, an animal is sentient when it has a lot of those responses, when it has a brain to coordinate those responses. But invertebrate animals, although they're not as sentient, I think they're just as important and valuable in our world today, and we need to recognize that. Scientists went badly wrong in that aspect, in focusing just on sentience.
And I would generally agree, right, that it's key to take an animal-centered position or approach, view of the world in order to make meaningful changes, because it has to be tailored and adapted to the animal or species in focus, right? So making no sense, as you just said, taking our perspective, but maybe going back and seeing it from the animal's perspective and their needs and what they can do. And I think, speaking, for example, of cephalopods or mollusks or so, I think wasn't there evidence, for example, that they feel pain, let's say, they would avoid a certain situation where they have learned a painful experience or fearful. Is that true? Am I correct?
Absolutely, and yes, and again, that's largely been the subject of Bob Elwood's work in the UK, and you can do a number of tests, and it's not just evidence from one test, but it's providing analgesics. Does their behavior change when you give them analgesics and then they have a painful stimulus? Can they remember where painful stimuli are and avoid those areas? All sorts of things like that. And throughout the book, I think I've tried to ask at least some of these big questions. And that one, I think, led me down the path of, what is animal life really all about? Why does animal life exist? And did a lot of thinking about that, particularly in relation to, whether animal life might be expected to exist on other planets. Came to the conclusion that it really is a response to variation in the environment, because what is life? It's the ability to replicate oneself, and in the case of animals, to be able to move and to find food, etc., but also the ability to change over time. That's a fundamental characteristic of life. So this was one of the big questions which I was considering in the book. Why does animal life exist? And it is actually somewhat ironic, I think, that in human terms, if we think of what animal life does, it has the ability to change through the passing on of genes, and the changing of genes between generations, if not within generations. But what we've done in the last 50 years or so has meant that the passing on of information has been less through genetic changes but actually much more through new means of communication, passing information in the form of computer and artificial intelligence. And to a large extent, we have obviated, we've made it unnecessary for us to have that genetic change, because we have these new means of passing on information. A scary thought.
Yeah.
Life is redundant, or is it?
Wow. Please not.
Big question.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how we start our weekend, right?
Yes. Who was it who said, if you ask a big question, you may be a fool for a minute, and I feel a bit of a fool for a minute, but if you don't ask the big questions, you're a fool for life.
Yeah, also very, very sad. Yeah. But, I mean, when you say wise, usually we consider people with a long life experience wise. When you look back on the years that you've experienced in the field of animal ethics and welfare, would you say that there has been improvement? I mean, changes for sure. Or are you also expecting certain changes, hopefully positive ones?
Yes. To bring us back to earth, Masha, literally, we'll come down to earth. And yes, I've seen changes. Several of which have stuck in my mind. One of which has been the improvement in the attitudes of veterinary students towards animals, very marked. Whether it's anything to do with the gender switch, I don't know. In fact, it's nearly all female, the cohorts of veterinary students now, compared when I started, it would be more like 50-50 male-female. That's one of the things that has stuck in my mind, has been a very beneficial change. Another has been, I think, a much greater willingness and openness to asking those big questions. I mean, I wasn't so involved in the very early stages of animal welfare debate back in the late 1970s, early 80s, when it all started. And remembering this is a relatively recent science. But in those days, there was still a lot of animal scientists who didn't believe that animals can feel pain. Which, to me, it now seems incredible. How long ago was it? It would be about 15 years ago that I took my dog to a vet in Australia. She had a cancer in her mammary tissue. And the vet recommended surgery. She had some surgery and most of the tumour was removed, but not quite all. So the vet said, I'd recommend chemotherapy for the dog. She was a young dog, only about 4 years of age. And I said, we were a long way from the place of treatment. It would have been a sort of 4-hour round trip. And I said, no, that's going to be very painful for the dog. No, the vet says, dogs don't feel pain, don't worry. I was dumbstruck. I was absolutely dumbstruck. I didn't say anything. I'm not going to get involved in those sort of arguments but yeah, so some, and that would have been an old vet, but new vets nowadays would never have that view, I'm absolutely sure. So yeah, things have changed a great deal. The concept, as you mentioned earlier, that what an animal might be missing by an early death is really quite novel now. Would not have been countenanced 10 years ago. And I've lost count of how many animal welfare scientists have told me when an animal's dead, it has no welfare. Don't even think about it. Well, we do think about it. And, I've always thought that is not absolutely true. That, an animal when it's born can expect to have a certain degree of welfare. And rather than humans attributing rights to animals, I think we have responsibilities, because we have so much impact on the environment throughout the world that we are impacting on animals all over the place, wild animals as well as domestic animals. And for that reason, I think we have to have that responsibility. If nothing more than, we don't want for our children and grandchildren not to have that heritage of animal life that you and I all grew up with. That enormous spectrum of animals with great genetic diversity. A huge pleasure to be part of that ecosystem with all those animals. If we lose all that, I think our generation has a lot to answer for.
And this, like the question, is death a harm or not? We also had this question during studies, I remember. And if I may ask, if we think also of improvements in terms of laws and regulations, like concrete examples where we see action. Am I right, for example, concerning these long distance transports, that there is movement, that there also have been changes, that it's partly banned or about to be? Is that correct?
Yes, Annette, you're certainly right. In this part of the world, things are moving quite rapidly. Well, say rapidly, over less than a decade. Australia will ban its export of sheep to the Middle East within the next 2 or 3 years. That has been a pledge of the Labour government now for about 5 or 6 years, so that looks pretty set to happen. At the same time, unfortunately, the new government in New Zealand has reversed the ban on New Zealand animals being exported alive. For many years, it was only breeding animals that could be exported, but I don't want to get too political about this. But we are seeing things moving quite significantly in this part of the world, and not only here as well. The UK has been moving to ban the live export of sheep. We have to put it into perspective, and I actually believe that the short journey across the English Channel in a truck is probably not going to be as harmful to sheep as, say, long journeys from northeastern Europe down to Spain. Without getting into all the technicalities of why that is, but we must put it into perspective. But it's one way in which I think we are seeing a groundswell of opinion. The Australian public have been against live export for many years, even since it first became particularly common back in the 1980s. We used to have a whole string of abattoirs around the north of Australia processing animals into meat for export, and back in the 1980s they realized that it was much cheaper to just put animals on a boat, and partly because in the Middle East they liked receiving live animals rather than dead animals. Then that it grew from there on into a very large trade. But there has been natural attrition anyway, so that live sheep trade over the last 20 years or so has gone from about 6 million animals a year to less than 1 million animals anyway, which is because of public sentiment, but also because of some of the droughts we've been having in Australia, it being very difficult, the low prices that sheep meat has been fetching, the low prices of the sheep production systems generally, wool being not particularly valuable, has encouraged sheep farmers to switch to cattle.
I think actually, just like one short comment on that. I think for now, in regard to like long distance transport, we can maybe expect for the future, for like the short term, more a shift of probably markets, so that specific countries are transporting less, but that we have then a shift to other regions of the world. Because there are like these global regulations or guidelines, for example, by WOHA, so by the World Organization for Animal Health, who have, I think, a big impact globally, for sure. But still, the market in Australia is maybe similar, or like the regulations to the European ones. But then we know that like industrial farming is highly increasing still in specific countries in Asia or Central Asia, for example. So I'm not really looking forward to that time, but I think within our time we will definitely see the change of the markets globally, because we are globalized. We are living in a globalized world. And while I'm still not looking forward to it, I'm also interested in how things will change in the future. But there's also kind of, actually guides me to the question of like young professionals, if they want to go into the field of animal welfare. And I myself, I'm not a researcher or anything. I'm just really, really interested into that topic. Is there maybe an advice or a feeling that you have in which direction young people can go or should go, and what kind of changes and new research fields will develop over time and they can have a look into?
Yes, the field is changing rapidly, as you say, Marsha, and there definitely is a big need for animal welfare scientists in developing countries, particularly in Asia, because, as you say, the market is moving there. China is developing its animal production enormously, even though the Chinese government has a policy of reducing meat consumption. But the demand from humans is there, and globally, meat consumption is increasing quite rapidly, particularly in Asian countries and South American countries. So there is a temptation to intensify, and where there's intensification, we need to have animal welfare scientists who can contribute to the debate, and hence focusing on areas like China is really important. But I think in the West as well, there is a need to move the science on. I mean, I've seen the science from its inception pretty much back in the 1980s, and it has changed a lot, and it will change a lot in future. One of the future trends is to use precision livestock farming to monitor animals and to look after their welfare. I'm a bit in two minds about that. I'm a bit old school and believe that the bond between the stock person and the animal is something that encourages animals to be well looked after. Whereas if animals are just being looked after by machines, then firstly, a lot of animals won't fit into that system, just like a lot of cows refuse to be milked by robots, and then they're not allowed to be cows anymore. So we don't breed from animals that refuse to be milked by robots anymore, that they're excluded. Is there an ethical issue there? I think there is. We're manipulating the genome in a big way, and that is one of the aspects of animal ethics that I think we often forget about. So in that we have a responsibility to animals, it's not just to animals' welfare, but it's responsibility to maintain the genome, to maintain the biodiversity of animals. Really, really important when we see how we have eroded that biodiversity in the last 50 years or so. So yes, really important that Western scientists get involved in things like precision livestock farming. And I think my main advice would be, don't be afraid to get ethics involved. There is, I think, here a difference between, say, there are cultural differences. In Europe, because of the diversity of cultures you have within that continent, it's very common for a pluralist attitude to prevail. So anything goes because, different cultures have supported and required that particular way of looking after animals. Whereas in America and in Australia, I think there's been much more focus on animals having rights which are more objectively determined. And we don't see that so much in Europe. It's all about improving their welfare through things like precision livestock farming. I'm not keen on that pluralist view, because I think there is a right and a wrong way to look after animals. There is an objective way in which we can assess animals' welfare, and giving all animals equivalent welfare, not necessarily the same resources, because, a sheep doesn't need what a pig needs, for example, but making sure that they all have a reasonable opportunity to have good welfare through their lifetime. I think we owe them that.
Thank you, and I also hope that our conversation inspires these young people and everyone wanting to educate and learn more in this sphere. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important that young people consider, they're going to look back at the end of their life. Have they improved conditions during their lifetime? That to me is very important. Have they done something, not necessarily scientific research? It could be editing an animal welfare series like you've done, Annette, or, it could be a whole range of different things. If you want to have a satisfying life, then I think looking to bring about some improvement is really important. It could be generating funds and using those to set up an animal shelter. There are so many ways in which we can try and restore the problems that humans have inflicted on animals in the last 50 years or so.
This is so true. Or sharing our knowledge via podcast, like we just did today, hoping to reach many more people and start or continue their thoughts in this area and just get engaged more. And as you say, do anything you can do.
Everyone has different skills.
Yeah.
I thought about being a vet when I was towards the end of secondary school. And there was a fatal moment, actually, when I was involved in a biology practical, and I was told to expose the gastrocnemius muscle, I think, in a frog, and I cut right through it. I said, I'm not going to be a vet. I couldn't do it. So, everyone has different skills, and those sort of practical skills were not mine. And I was very happy to turn my attention to thinking about animals rather than physically trying to make them better. But I take my hat off to all those who have and do spend their lives looking after the health of animals.
Yeah, I always believe that actually starting to talk about things is one of the key tools actually to start change and to start thinking, to exchange views, to exchange opinions. And so, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us and also the audience today. It was really a great pleasure to meet you. And I'm also looking forward to read more about your work in the future. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here to the listeners with us at Dare to Care. Thank you for taking the time to listen again, and I really hope that you've taken something with you. To start the next conversation, to start talking about it.
Then thank you also from my side, of course. And as always, we will equip the show notes with more interesting material for you. Of course, you will also find the link to Clive's free ebook there. So enjoy reading and further thinking.
And if you also liked what you've heard today, then give us a great review, hopefully 5 stars. And I also, not only I, but Annette and I would always love to hear your thoughts and questions. If you have feedback, you can also write us an email at podcast.daretocare@gmail.com. But you also can write us on Instagram, daretocare_podcast. And remember, we need to stand up for each other and especially for the other species, the non-human animals. Bye-bye.